Great.
Mhm. Yeah.
Okay.
Um, I got my start with live action role play. I uh was at the Wayfinder Experience, which is the same summer camp Brennan Lee Mulligan went to. Um, I did a lot of running around in the woods pretending to be an elf, and then eventually at a certain point, I was like, well, I can't always run around in the woods and pretend to be an elf. What if I like sit around a table and pretend to run around in the woods and like describe doing that? And then I was kind of immediately like, okay, I don't really get the fuss. I had some other friends who really liked tabletop role-playing games. But something like I realized at a certain point with some certain games, like, oh, there's some ways this can be really interesting in ways that you can't do when you're so concerned with everything being physical. And that was in like 2016, 2017. I published my first game online in 2018, although I've been designing games at my college kind of through then. And then 2019, I dropped out of college, launched my first crowdfunder, had a very wild year. And that kind of was what got the ball rolling on me doing all this professionally. But I've been making games kind of all my life in one form or another.
Yeah. So I'm just putting a link to Possum Creek Games, Wander
Yeah.
Home, which is a game that was it's your first game. I mean, it's your first game
It
that
was my
blows
first
up.
big game. It came out in 2020. It was published in 2020. I did Sleepaway before Wander Home, so I
Right.
released Sleepaway in 2019, which, excuse me, was a queer horror game about a summer camp that was haunted by this ghost. And then Wander Home was in 2020, and that's like a pastoral animal game about these like traveling animal folk in a post-war world. And then Yozeba's Bed and Breakfast was my the kind of big thing. My dear friend Maisie and I worked together on it for many years, and it came out in 2023-ish. Um, and yeah, there's a lot of I don't know, for a lot of my work, kind of especially when I was younger, was really concerned with uh what like in particular with games where there's such a focus on combat. Like if you've played video games, you know how much like violence can be a core part of a lot of those games. Or even if you engage with our culture is kind of distinctly fixated on violence in a way that like is rather weird if you take a step back. And violence has this property that kind of drowns out everything else going on. And so I didn't really enjoy using violence as the way a lot of other people do. And if I was going to use violence, I kind of wanted to do so understanding it well. And so when I was younger, a lot of my work kind of removed violence or sidestepped violence so that I could explore what else was there. And a lot of my more recent work has been about like, okay, now that I know what else is there, let me add violence back in and think about what's happening when it's coming back in.
So when you think about, so we've taken a look, right? As everybody knows, we've taken a look at Little Wars and that particular like tradition. When you think about your relationship to, since you know that history,
Hmm.
like when you think about what Wells is doing and that kind of relationship to violence, what's the distinction?
Yeah, well, I think that there's, as you know very well, there's many traditions for where RPGs come from. And the dominant one, the one that kind of comes to people's lips when they talk about it, is through wargaming, right? That there's this kind of particular legacy that some people really like trotting out, which is like, well, you start with the Kriegspiels, you start with chess, and then you do the Kriegspiels of the 1900s, or sorry, the 1800s, which was like, complex war simulations for German generals. And then you're like, well, what if while we're doing we get so complex that we don't even bother having rules, we just have someone arbitrate them, and that becomes free Kriegspiel. And then you're like, well, what if instead of these armies were individual people, and then suddenly it's like you're doing Dungeons and Dragons. And that's like one particular arc people really like to trot out. And that is very much focused on like, first and foremost, there is a fascination with violence and war, and specifically there is a use for this to simulate war, right? There's a capacity to use games to understand how war happens, uh and like it serves a like a strategic and tactical function beyond mere play. And that I think is kind of the dominant way people talk about it. And it's always been the way I don't like talking about it. It's not how I like thinking about games. It's not how I track my personal lineage, my personal history. I think that the way in which games kind of relate to violence can often just as often obscure kind of what violence is, right? That like by turning war into a game, it gave German generals the ability to avoid thinking about the very human cost of war, which is actually what led into World War One, where you've got all these generals who have spent the past 100 years training in this Napoleonic mindset of like how they think games should be and how they think war should be, and then arriving and seeing the reality of war and being confused and completely underprepared for the massive horrible toll that that causes. And I think culturally there's a similar thing where culturally there's such an alienation from violence that people find it playful, right? That like in very direct ways, Jacob Geller has talked about how uh, the realities of school shootings and of like mass casualty events mirror or like like they feed back and forth with the logics of violent games, not in a way where violent games cause these events, but in a way that the logic of the event is shaped by how the shooter expects it to go, right? That the actions of violence reflect how the culture that violence comes from. Um, and I like to explore other things. I don't know. I like to try to get out of that particular history and try to kind of build my own histories, my own genealogies of RPGs in ways that can be a lot more interdisciplinary and a lot more freeing.
Yeah. And when you think about that genealogy, like I know what you're gonna say. I
Mhm.
have a sense of what you're gonna say, but when you think about that
Yeah.
genealogy, what is it?
Well, of course, I think some of my biggest debt is to the Bakers. Meg Baker will be here for you next week or the week after, and they were incredibly influential on my own personal immediate genealogy. There's also live action role play, which comes out of this like hippie moment in the 60s and 70s, like at the Omega Institute, which is very like all very kind of like you've got a bunch of like hippies dressing up as fairies and like doing shrooms and like reenacting Lord of the Rings, and then like that pivots into like, well, what if we don't have to do shrooms about it? And then what if we're just playing pretend? And then like you've also got, of course, the Bronte sisters, but you also have like forum role plays. Like for me, a big thing was being a Zoomer and like going onto the internet and like, like logging a little family computer and playing like I would pretend to be like a cat in the Warrior Cats role play or like whatever. You know what I mean? Like there was a lot of these like digital spaces that were really impactful for me that uh were more about kind of taking a fictional world we all cared about and turning them into or Homestuck, God, things like that. Uh,
Yeah.
yeah.
Um, so I'm curious, as we think about this, um, you are one of the more literary, like when you cite influences on Yazebas, right? The two things that you compare this to are Saturday morning cartoons and fan fiction.
hmm
And so I'm curious, in what ways are games like literature and not like literature, do you think?
Yeah, this has been an interesting question for me, especially as I fantasize about like maybe someday I'll take a break from games and I'll write a book. I'll write a novel or something. And I tried and it was bad because that's how your first novel has to be. And one of the big reasons it was bad is because when writing a game, you need to leave space to invite the player in, right? That as a game, like it's like how a script is, where it's like when you write a script to a play or a movie, you don't want to say like you're not going to micromanage every single aspect of it because the actors, the director, the staging crew, all that needs space to do their jobs. You need to trust them. And with a game, it's a similar thing where it's like, I don't want to micromanage your perception of the world because I want to invite you in and for you to fill in. A novel has a different quality. A novel needs to be something that fully it's a one man show. You know what I mean? Like it's a world that fully invites you in on every level. And so I think that one of the biggest differences is just that like games are a work of art designed to prompt a second work of art, right? That they necessarily have a relationship with the act of playing it, which is the game, right? There's the game text and the game experience. Whereas a novel, the downstream work of art, quote unquote, the act of reading the novel is so like entwined with the text that there's not much going from that. And when you do end up going further from that, right? If you do read if you do read Moby Dick and you're like, oh my God, that was so interesting, but I wish that there was more explicit gay romance. Then and you go and you write a second novel about the gay adventures of Ishmael. That's that's fan fiction, right? And that's second order creative work that like is inherently subservient. Whereas with games, there's like a my 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 text of the game is not necessarily subservient to like the time you spend playing it. So there's like these different relationships between the art and then the art that it inspires. That for me is the big difference. Sorry, that's kind of like a weird answer.
No, I think that's a really good one. And I think that's a good one to shape. We've been talking a little bit about games and how they relate to play scripts, right? That a script is
Hmm.
something that we do analyze in classrooms,
Hmm.
even though we know it doesn't come to full life until you get the people involved.
Yeah.
So when you sit down and look at either a game that you're developing or a
Hmm.
game that you're trying to understand or read, what are
Hmm.
you looking for? What are you paying close attention to?
So I think that the first thing that I hold tight onto is the fact that in the same way that with scripts, a good director and a good crew and kind of, good actors can take a mediocre script and elevate it to greatness. Uh, and similarly, a bad crew and bad director and all that stuff can take a phenomenal script and make it crash and burn. Similarly, like a game like reading a game is going to be different than seeing the game played, but also playing a game is not necessarily going to give you insight. Like those both give you different kinds of insight, right?
You're going to want to
And
make a note of that, guys, because Quentin Smith is going to argue, I think, slightly opposite.
oh yeah,
And
totally, yeah.
and I think that I mean both perspectives I think are really useful.
Hmm.
So
Well,
yeah.
especially because I think Quinn's is a reviewer and so has his very kind of like he has an approach and an approach to talking about games that he needs to stick to very consistently. Whereas I'm a designer and so what I'm looking for in a game can be very different, right? That I can read a game and I can have an interesting idea, and even if in practice that idea doesn't work, learning about that idea is valuable for my art, even if like the text itself doesn't necessarily do a good job pitching it. Um, but I think the big things I look for is that I try to, when I read a game, I kind of try to think about uh what it would be like to kind of go through the actions, not necessarily because I understand how it all fits together. Sometimes, like, I just can't, like, the logic of it feels a bit daunting for me. But I think about, like, I just kind of try to, like, think about the feeling of the actions, right? Like, the game says, roll these dice, and I kind of think about what it's like to roll the dice. It says, write these things down. I'm thinking about what it's like to write these things down. And almost for me, there's a sensation of what a game is like that before I play it that is almost this like abstract painting of the game, right? Where it's like a tactile thing that I kind of try to figure out and fit into my head, and then the actual mechanics of the game kind of become part of that. Where it's like maybe an easier example would be a project I've been working on with Seven Part Pact, where there's seven different board games, and each one of them I first kind of fleshed out abstractly, like what are the set of sensations? Like this is a board game about being the wizard in charge of the oceans. So I want to have this feeling of like there's like a thin layer of civilization on top of this great big seething nature. And I'm interested in like these feelings of these like tiny little pieces floating atop this kind of great big darkness. And there's these things surging underneath that like feel almost unknowable. Like I want to have those qualities of like the tiny lighthouse at the big ocean. How do I no, no, okay, once I've got that, right? How do I then make that work precisely? And when I'm reading a game, I can't necessarily come away with a perfect knowledge of how it works precisely, but I do try to find that almost like abstract feeling, like what's the big picture, what's the like the shape of it all, and I try to find that, and then as I learn the mechanics, they fit into that, or they complicate it, or they challenge that.
So if we apply that to say if we were reading Yazeba's feeling, mechanics, how those connect, can you
Yeah.
walk us through how we could take a look at that and understand it?
Yeah, absolutely. So the big goal with Yazebas was all these little chapters where each chapter is its own like set of little rules. And so those little rules are all scaffolded together by this meta structure, right? You've got these stickers that let you unlock more chapters, let you change characters, but within that, within the like within each chapter, the rules could be totally different every single time because the goal of the rules was to of each chapter was to paint, all these different portraits of these little moments. Yeah, those are what the stickers look like. And so I think that like a way to engage with Yazebas is that Yazebas is not a game where the rules of the game are the center of how you talk about it, right? Because if you imagine a game like chess, when you describe chess to someone, you describe the rules of chess. You do not get hung up on like how exactly a castle flies, 800 feet from one end of the board to the other. That's not what's on your mind. With chess, it's like the rules are the central thing. The fiction is entirely superfluous. There are other games where the fiction is the central thing. And then the rules are almost they can almost be whatever, right? You can swap out the rules to do whatever you want. And often that happens accidentally. Dungeons and Dragons is almost a good example of that because it's a game where uh people love to be like, "Oh, I don't even play with the rules of Dungeons and Dragons." It's just we kind of just are our characters and we do whatever. And it's like that's totally fine and good. That's a completely legitimate way to play. But it means the rules are very secondary to what it means to play Dungeons and Dragons. And so Eusebius was like, "Well, what if we do this on purpose and we just have a bunch of these little rules objects?" So I think what I recommend for when reading Eusebius and looking at the chapters is when you're reading the actual rules of any particular chapter, don't get too hung up on the precise movements of them, but I think try to think more about like, for example, this chapter uses a deck of cards. What does using that deck of cards do for the chapter? Does it create a sense of like impending doom? Does it create like a feeling of like anticipation and uncertainty, like you're unearthing things, right? This chapter uses coins. Why does it use coins? Like think about the big emotions that these things elicit and focus, I would say, just as much on the fantasy that is being evoked rather than like how little specific pieces fit together.
Yeah, and I think I have a suspicion we're going to be playing Azabos on Wednesday, guys. So you're going to see this in hand. We'll apply our reading to our playing. I just played this with a group of gamers this weekend, and indeed, the very difficult thing that they had as a first question was, "What's the objective?" Right? Because chess
Hmm.
has an objective. You want to win, and you
Hmm.
win by capturing the queen,
Absolutely.
as my nephew would tell you with greater authority than I do.
Of course,
Um,
of course. Yeah, you win by capturing the queen. That's how chess works. Of
right.
course.
And there's different kinds of moves, and they've been highly codified, so much so that a computer
Hmm.
can play it. You and I have
Hmm.
talked about this. Um,
Hmm.
Jay, how do you win Yazebas?
So that's the thing that's fun about tabletop games, right? Or like tabletop RPGs, is that with Yazebas, it's like in any particular chapter, there might be a goal. Like it might say, the chapter ends when you let me take a step back actually. There's two kinds of things we can talk about. And chess actually is a great example for this. There's end states and there's goals. So for example, in chess, the game ends when either a king is checkmated or when one of a few different draw conditions are reached. Um, that ends the game. Your goal is that you want to checkmate the opponent's king. Uh, by default. If I sit down to play chess and I decide my goal is to get checkmated as quickly as possible, the rules of chess, including its end state, can be the same, but I have changed my internal goal about what I'm trying to get out of chess. if you've ever sat down to play against someone who you just know is better than you, and you're like, well, my goal is just to kind of goof around and be silly, or my goal is to like last as long as I can. It's like you've adjusted your perspective on what that internal goal is while acknowledging the end state is the same. Yozeba's has a lot of end states, right? A chapter ends when this thing or that thing is met, when this event or that event occurs. Um, Oftentimes the goal is to like there's kind of there are very easy goals to set, right? Where it's like if we're playing the breakfast chapter and we know the chapter ends when we make enough pancakes, we might decide that our goal is to make breakfast well, right? Is to make an efficient breakfast or make a good breakfast. But maybe you sit down and you're like, I want to cause some chaos. I want my goal to be to fuck up this breakfast. And now you're playing to try to ruin try to go against the other player's goals there. Or maybe you're like, well, my goal is actually to focus on my character's growth. I'm invested in this character. I want to help them out. I'm not thinking about the breakfast. I'm thinking about my character. That is also a legitimate goal. So the challenge of an RPG, the thing that's fun about an RPG is that uh the goals you set can be in relationship to the game, and you can set many different goals based on your perspective of the character. So that means that there are some goals that are going to be easier or more obvious than others, but also, and the thing that I always love about RPGs is that there's a lot of fun to be had in intentionally setting goals against that, right? Like my favorite RPGs, the ones I found most rewarding, are ones where the goals of the text, like where like there's an apparent goal that is not actually something I want, and therefore I have to set a goal that goes against the apparent goal of the game. The example I often talk about is if we were to play chess, but to pretend that we were secret lovers from two disparate families, and our one way we were allowed to communicate with each other was by playing chess with each other. We couldn't say any words out loud. It's just the movement of the chess pieces. Are we still trying to checkmate each other? Is that actually now our goal? Or does that end our capacity to communicate, right? Does the way in which we move change, the game actions we take change, even though all the rules are the same? But if we set this different goal inside of ourselves, we unlock a new game that we get to play.
Yeah. So I think that give has given us a good kind of starting point of different things that we can talk about. And so I'm curious, folks can either put into chat if for whatever reason they feel like they need to stay on mute, or you can unmute yourself and start yapping. Uh, Jules, I know can rely on you once you finish chewing.
Okay, it's just gum, so we got it. But so like reading through the chapters that we were assigned in the Zabas, how do you decide like how to write a rule book? Like what's the best way to like show your players how to play your game?
Yeah. I think that there are two contradictory impulses that make always writing an RPG, there's always a tension between these two things. The first one is that you want someone sitting down and reading your game for the first time to feel as like welcomed in and to be taught it and to have kind of this like very comfortable, fluid reading experience of like you can learn this game through just sitting and reading and like that feel like the first time reader is one important quality. The second important quality is your mid game. You're trying to remember how something works. You're looking it up really fast, and that's the kind of the mid game, the mid game reader, or the like repeat reader, the index reader, I guess. And always, every single game, and you'll see this everywhere once you know about it, every single game is trying to find the balance between those two things. And there's a lot of techniques that are really useful for the first time reader, things that I do a lot, like trying to have a particular narrative voice and like trying to kind of scaffold things with like, kind of contextualizing it in the fiction and like having a little bit of like fluff and like, I don't know, like writing it more prosaically than like instructionally that is really valuable for the first time reader, but can be sometimes a little frustrating for the mid game reader. And so I try to kind of like I know that I prefer to lean towards writing games that are more florid and more inviting and more like playful in its text. And then if the rules aren't that dense, it becomes easier for someone mid-game to kind of look up the thing they need because there's just not that much that they need to keep track of. Whereas if you have a game that has a lot of rules and they all really densely interlock with each other, you're going to want to kind of drop that more narrative voice and you want to kind of go in on like, well, let me be instructive because I need to make sure you get these big bullet points as quickly and efficiently as possible. And so every single game, and like even games, like every single game is kind of somewhere on that, like kind of balancing those two things because there's no good answer, right? There's no one thing that is good for both readers. It can be really useful if you're in the middle of the game to just have a big table of like a page of just densely packed references. But if you're trying to learn the game, that is a nightmare to have thrown at you. Um, and so yeah, that's the big challenge of the back and forth. The call for Yazebas was we leaned more towards that kind of playful storybook, that kind of like that kind of whimsical writing style, both because it makes the book kind of a more inviting, fun thing to sit with, but also because um it from our point of view, each individual chapter is not so much. And so the goal is kind of to invite people in and pull people in onto that level. And then once you're playing, like you get familiar with the game and you can kind of follow the patterns we've set out more comfortably. But our big goal was to make sure that someone's picking up and reading it for the first time could be present with it.
Yeah, because what you're describing, right, is that there's a loop of most of the play experience in most games that you're trying to get someone kind of into the habit of.
Yeah. Well, one of the things we talk about with Yazebas when we were designing it was that there's this challenge that we called the second chapter problem, which is the first time you sit down and play Yazebas, it goes really smoothly. And then the second time you sit down and play Yazebas, you pick up a different chapter. And if that chapter has completely different rules, it can be tough to unlearn the previous rules and relearn these new rules. And we went back and forth on that a lot because obviously that's like a problem. There's not a lot of easy solutions for a game that wants to be so modular. And the conclusion we came to was that if you're in a spot where you sat down, you played the game for 60 to 90 minutes, and you were like, that was so much fun, I want to do it again. You have committed an amount of energy willing to learn a different chapter, right? You're willing to do that kind of we've gotten you to the threshold of being willing to do that work. The hardest part of getting new players is getting them to sit down for the first time at all. So if you've gotten someone to sit down and they went, that was so much fun, let's do it again. And there's a little hurdle at the let's do it after the let's do it again part. That's still a huge triumph, right? That's a fine spot for that little hurdle to occur because it's a lot easier to overcome it once you've already bought in a second time because then it's just oh well now like I know that's going to happen for the third time and you've already done it twice. Whereas like if that hurdle came up, the moment you sat down, if that was like a hurdle that was you encountered just as you went to play, you'd probably say screw it and just play Parcheesi instead or something, right? Like there's a way that like if the hurdle was too soon, it would like that like it's so much harder to get someone to come back than it is to get someone who came back twice to come back a third time.
Yeah. Yeah, and I had open, and since I know that the recording is only going to show me when I'm talking, I'm just going to note, right? This is what one of the things that we're talking about. Like this is a page of rules that I'm inexpertly pointing at the camera. These are rules about player behavior that are written in the voice of Hey Kid, the, hyperactive demon child who is near and dear to my heart.
Hmm.
Um, and it's fun to read out loud because of the voice. There's no wrong way to play. Don't worry if some piece of paper somewhere disagrees with you. Don't worry if you don't feel like you don't know what you're doing. I just make up rules as I go along, and if it's a fun game, it'll still be fun. Which is also uh, an interesting construction on the part of this game to basically say if the rules are in the way of your fun, you can ignore them, which is an interesting gesture as well. Um,
Hmm.
but yeah, so other questions, curiosities for our first resident game designer. Thoughts and curiosities. Or Jay and I'll just start talking about playtests and weird stuff. Um, I mean, my goal here is to turn this into a reference that you guys can come back to. The transcript will be here to help you out as you work on play reports. Jay and Meg A are here just to kind of be transparent about pedagogy to help you as you start to generate these play reports and help guide your ways of seeing and looking and engaging. So I guess the other question that we can get on the record is you've done play tests. I've been part of them.
Hmm.
Um,
Thank you.
yeah. And so I'm curious about the kinds of documentation of a playtest. Like, what's useful information that you're looking for when either you're playing a game or you're kind of watching other people play a game that you're designing?
The big wisdom with playtesting, and this is also true if you are not a game designer, if you are a writer or if you are an artist, is that the emotional your audience is always right about the things they feel. They have no clue why things make them feel that way. That if someone walks up to your painting and they say, "This makes me feel really scared," they're right. It does make them feel really scared. If you ask them why, and they say, "Oh, the figure has really intense eyes," they might be completely wrong about that, right? They might be totally wrong about the thing that is making them feel that way. They don't necessarily have a handle on it, right? If they read your book and they're like, "Your book really plods along," and you're like, "Why?" and they're like, "Oh, well, it was, there's too much talking." Maybe it wasn't that there was too much talking, but it's that the talking wasn't moving things forward enough, right? Maybe they just are wrong about what causes it. Similarly, with game design, when I run playtesting, the thing I'm always looking for are people's emotional responses. And then the moment people start telling me how to fix it, I start tuning them out. You'll have all the time people being like, I'll sit down, people will be like, "This is the thing that made me feel this way." And I go, "Fascinating, thank you." And then they say, "And this is what you should do about it." I'm like, "No." I know what I need to do about it. You don't know. And that's not because I'm arrogant. It's just that like I've spent more time staring at the game than they have. And maybe sometimes they're right. And I do enjoy it when they say that. I just try to always redirect back to the emotions, right? That's kind of always my central like, it made you feel this way. Okay, what can we do about it, right? Where it's like an easy example, when we were playtesting together, there was a period where you and Abria were the sorcerer and the Faustian, and neither of you were both kind of having these like you weren't really involved that much. You didn't have that much to do or worry about. And I think that someone could have been in your like up to that point in playtesting feedback, I'd had responses that were like people being like, "Oh, well, the sorcerer um the sorcerer like feels like disconnected or alien or like unmoored." And it became clear like no, no, no. The sorcerer the problem is that the sorcerer was like didn't have enough on their plate in ways that were interesting, right? They had a lot of stuff to worry about, but none of it really mattered. And so figuring out what was the actual cause of the thing mechanically and seeing kind of how people respond to it, seeing how people respond emotionally, and then going, "Whoa, wait, that response was good. I like that. Oh, that response was messy. I don't like that," is kind of the really important part of playtesting. And also why it's necessary to do a lot of playtesting because it's very easy to have situations where a good player can actually obscure a good player or a bad player can actually obscure what is causing a response. Like if I just had our playtest to go off of with Abria as the Faustian, Abria is a skilled GM, and so she knew how to really buy into having, lots of, like just making herself busy. But I realized afterwards and doing more playtests with the Faustian that I was like, oh, the Faustian is just as under direct as the Sorcerer. It just wasn't apparent because of Abria's like experience acting and performing and playing up things to do. Um, and so that kind of like seeing how people engage, being able to see it multiple times, see the patterns is really critical. But there's a common misconception that playtesting is about like making sure your game is fun, and I'm really anti-fun. You'll never hear me describing something as fun, unless I would describe it as pretty. You know what I mean? Like pretty and fun are equivalently useful words. And if you've ever talked to an artist, you'll know that they'll get kind of annoyed if you call their art pretty. Um, like it's not really a useful thing to say. Fun is similar, and the reason for that is because fun fun is a subjective personal experience that's a bit vapid and also uh, isn't necessarily the thing you're trying to do. I remember very early on while working on my wizard game, one player's feedback was that they were really stressed out and frustrated because uh, their wizard didn't have enough time to spend with their family, that they wanted to see their wife and their kids, but their job was too overwhelming. They were too stressed out with work to spend time with the people they love. They were like, this is really stressful and not fun. I'm like, yeah, yeah, yeah. That's what I'm trying to do. That's what I wanted to do to you. That's what this game is about. So in those ways, like actually figuring out what is happening underneath the fun can be a lot more valuable.
Yeah, and tying that, I mean, I'm curious in terms of tying it back into you saw me with or have a kind of particular kind of play experience and you saw it
Hmm.
replicated. You saw similar kinds of weaknesses. How do you tie that back to the text itself, right? The thing that
Hmm.
is stable.
And that, yeah, which is always so hard because it's like you can't necessarily predict how people respond to a text, right? You show 100 different people a book, and they, in some ways, read 100 different books, right? They're always bringing their own stuff to it, but there's certain patterns you can start to observe in terms of what people miss, what people respond to, what excites them. A really easy example that shows up in some of my other work is a lot of my work has what are called pick lists, which are lists of different options that they choose some number of to help flesh out their character. And what I notice is, okay, what are the lists where if there's an option that 100% of the people pick, that's a bad option because that should just be part of the character. If people are picking it every single time, then it's actually they're responding to it in a way that like means the other options don't exist. So I need to make it less appealing or I need to make it more I just need to give the character that. Meanwhile, on the flip side, if there's an option that people never pick, that one's bad. But there's a lot of good options that get picked one out of every 10 times, right? Where it's like I have 10 people sit down to play the game, and once in a while someone picks this option. And when they do, it's very important and critical to them. But the other 9 times, no one cares. And those are to me the best options because it's about finding the ways like, okay, most of the time people don't need to respond to this, but when they do respond to it, they have a really intense response, and that's really valuable. And finding those areas where like, okay, people generally like this concept. You know, there's things in Yazebas where it's like um oh my goodness, it's been a while since I've sat with the text, but like there's some chapters that people love to be they're like, that's the chapter I want to play. And like pretty consistently, like people sitting down for the first time will go for like one of a few chapters. And that's great because it's like, cool, we know those chapters. We know, we were able to kind of like help steer towards those chapters. There's some chapters people very rarely go for. That's okay too. We're still able to like, make sure that when people do pick those, it's worthwhile. And so those kinds of things that like, uh, it comes back to the text because it's like you're seeing people's responses and you're adjusting the text and you're seeing their responses and you're adjusting the text. And at the end of the day, you're gonna have to say, I'm done at some point. You have to throw down your pencil and say it's static. But you have to kind of through that see how people keep responding to it and just try to kind of make sure that it catches them in the ways it catches them in the way you want to catch them, right? That if there's something that throws them off, you want it to throw them off. If there's something that feels familiar, you want it to feel familiar. And you can't control their response, but you can generally get a pretty good sense after a while of like the set of responses, right? That like maybe there's 10 different ways in which someone engages with part of your game. And by the end of playtesting, you'll have gotten familiar with the most common 7 of them. And that's plenty, Like you don't have to list them out, but like you develop a sense for them. You develop a sense of like what are the kinds of people who engage with this and what are the kinds of responses that get elicited.
So, play reports that are coming to you as a designer, and that's kind of what we're thinking about in terms of this the genre of the play report. We're gonna like get to like public facing documents later, but this is this
Mm-hmm.
observational tool that's often sent to designers. And so it sounds like what's interesting about the play report is a kind of dual specificity, both the specificity of like the feeling of the player or the experience the player is having in a very particular moment, keyed to at if not a specific moment in the text, but like to a game mechanic or something that's described or a particular moment in the cycle of play. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely. I think so.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
and so if so these guys are going to be writing their first play reports on
Yeah.
play experiences they're going to have in class,
Mm-hmm.
including with Zeebs.
Yeah.
And so if we were still in old there and there may be a second edition of this, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if those play reports were coming to you, what would be the kinds of things in addition to what we've been talking about that would
Mm-hmm.
be things that you would want them to take a look at or to
Yeah.
keep a close eye on or document closely?
Yeah, I think the things that are always the most interesting to me, right? I mean, I guess almost selfishly as the designer, I'm always very interested, of course, in the ways that the text influenced your play, right? Because there's almost two kinds of play that can happen. There's kind of play that's very responding to the text, and there's kind of play that you're doing, kind of responding to others at the table or responding to yourself or kind of just, getting to like sometimes someone will tell me about their game and I'll be like that, like the other play experience, and I'll be like that sounds really wonderful. It almost has nothing to do with what I wrote. You just went and had a lovely time with your friends, which admittedly is a great feeling. I'm so glad that I could give them that, right? That I could give them the alibi to like go have a lovely time with their friends. There's a great quote from Ben Yahtzee Crowbar, who is a video game reviewer, where he says that uh, single player video games are always at a disadvantage compared to multiplayer video games because multiplayer video games have the fail state that you could have a good time hitting your friends with a dead trout in the woods if you've had enough to drink. So, a multiplayer video game, like the worst case scenario, is that you are hanging out with your friends. And a single player video game, the worst case scenario is that you are having a bad time alone in your room, which is like horrible. So, uh, similarly, tabletop games, there's always the fail state of like if nothing else you are enjoying the company of the people you love, and that's cool. Or I guess you're enjoying the company of your classmates, which is less cool, but still enjoyable. I think that like there's no I don't know if there's gonna be like a thing that will like I don't know if like I think when I read play reports, the thing that I'm oftentimes looking for, because again I'm a designer and I have an angle that I'm looking for, I want to see I want to see how people engage with the text. I'm very centered on their response to the text. This is not the only thing people look for from it, and it's not the only approach. It's certainly not the only way you have to bring yourself to it. It's just the thing I look for because of my method. Brennan Lee Mulligan and I had a really interesting conversation one time, kind of early on, where he talked about the difference between us being that he is a race car driver and I'm an auto mechanic. And so for Brennan, he doesn't need to know exactly how cars work. He needs to know how his car works, and he needs to be able to drive it really, really well to do his job. I need to know how a lot of different cars work, and I need to be able to take them apart and put them back together again. But my concern is still also ultimately with like a particular angle on cars, right? And then, someone else like Quinn's as a reviewer is someone who is looking at cars from a particular perspective and is seeking out cars that do certain things in certain ways. And so I might have a lot of fondness for a vehicle that is a cantankerous piece of shit, but I find really interesting. Whereas Quinn's is trying to ultimately make recommendations. And so all of our different relationships, and then there's other people who are like, I don't care about any of this. I'm gonna, I've got a horse-drawn wagon that I bring to, town every day, and I'm like, that's great, like that's your thing that you've built that has nothing to do with me. And so all these different approaches are like legitimate ones. Ultimately, at the core of it, the game is this object that we all have in front of us, and different writers are gonna have different relationships to talking about it.
It's so interesting to kind of bring this back to more traditional media, because the same is still true, right? That that there's schools of thought and ways of understanding that are about production and how something is made and understanding something from the features that make it up. And there's that,
Hmm.
and that's part of what this class is, right? That appreciation that comes from understanding how something is built. And then there's the kind of the aesthetics of the thing and how it makes you feel. And that's very particular and taste based. And cultivating one's taste is also part of what we're doing here. And you know, communicating evaluation is yet another thing, right? Is like what makes a good game, what makes a good novel. Obviously, there's lots of different kinds of good novels, and we talk about bad ones all the time, right? Book Talk is filled with dramatic readings of terrible prose, um to say nothing of YouTube.
Hmm.
And Yahtzee, certainly I've put the link into chat because so much of his interest in criticism is kind of noting either patterns of things that are becoming irritating
Hmm.
because everyone is doing them. So they weren't bad to begin with, but now they're so pervasive that they're not
Hmm.
interesting anymore. Or when something is done badly in those kinds of ways.
I think
Um,
also,
yeah.
if I may, another reviewer or another person who talks about games whose work I think is worth knowing about. And again, this is video games because video games has so much more space than tabletop RPGs, but there's a lot of stuff that's cross applicable. Jacob Geller does really interesting videos on games, and I think frequently the thing I find interesting is that he talks about his experience playing games and engaging with art. He also kind of brings in, paintings and books and movies that kind of like all relate to his he uses these experiences to thread a common story from them. So he says like, you know, he's thinking about the fear of the dark, for example. And he brings up games that build on that, and he brings up art that builds on that, and he brings up various different things that all together build on this concept of the fear of the dark. And he threads that together to kind of provide different perspectives, and he uses a game report, a game experience as a secondary tool to talk about a deeper thing. So there's also that there's like both the angle of like, why are you talking about the game? Like what is on the other side of that for you? And like, are you talking about the game because you want to talk about the game, or are you talking about the game because you want to talk about something else? Um, Finally, one other game person who I think people should talk about more is Dan Thurot, who does reviews of board games. And one of his reviews in particular was really striking for me. Let me see if I can find it while I scroll. But it was he's got a couple very good reviews, but one of them that really stood out to me was about a game about immediate post 100 to 300 CE. Yes, here it is. The review is called about the game called The Great Commission, which is about kind of like around the Council of Nicaea, kind of this early Christian moment. And he himself is religious, and he uses this kind of mediocre board game and his play experience with it to talk about like doubt and exegesis and like his and grief and his relationship to God in a way that is like deeply compelling and fascinating. And like he takes a pretty mediocre board game and uses it as a vehicle to talk about some really valuable and deep stuff. And so you can either say like, I want to write about this game because I want to write about this game, or you can say I want to use this game as a way to talk about something else. And both of those are legitimate. They're just different ways you can use kind of the art of discussing an object.
Yeah, I mean, and this is its own thread of cultural criticism, right? Which is
Hmm.
also the stuff of this class, right? Sometimes a game becomes this kind of connective tissue or occasion through which to talk about ideas. And this is something, interestingly, that literary history does a fair amount, right? Which is um, sometimes a failure or an imperfect form is just as useful and interesting, and maybe even more so because like the light is
Hmm.
where the cracks get through. Or the same
Yeah.
way that like we took a look at a copy that I have of Tristram Shandy from the 18th century and we could see how it was made because it has fallen apart,
Yeah.
right?
There's a wonderful Brian Eno quote. Um, uh, Let me find it really quickly. Here it is. Whatever you now find weird, ugly, uncomfortable, and nasty about a new medium will surely become its signature. CD distortion, the jitteriness of digital video, the cracked sound of 8-bit, all of these will be cherished and emulated as soon as they can be avoided. It's the sound of failure. So much modern art is the sound of things going out of control, of a medium pushing to its limits and breaking apart. The distorted guitar sound is the sound of something too loud for the medium supposed to carry it. The blues singer with the cracked voice is the sound of an emotional cry too powerful for the throat that releases it. The excitement of grainy film of bleached out black and white is the excitement of witnessing events too momentous for the medium assigned to record them. And I think that that is also often true about games, right? That part of the thrill and the value of a game is the moments when it goes wrong, the moments when the game fumbles, and the way we catch each other when it does.
Absolutely. Yeah, I love that. I am actively adding these all, by the way, to our weekly instructions so that you have them for the future, even if you don't catch them in chat. Um, so yeah, no, I think that's so incredibly helpful and liberatory. I think a lot of the time when we come into English majors or equivalent, we think about this as exclusively the work of looking at the great and the good and the classics. And I think, and there's incredible importance to that. Um, but also looking at these kinds of both the friction that provides its own kind of nostalgic pleasure, because sometimes we're English majors because we're nerds about old stuff as well. But also these kinds of thought processes about why did we get hung up at some point on perfection in these kinds of ways?
I mean,
Um,
in some ways, I deeply sympathize as someone who is a control freak. Someone who
Also that
spent four
part.
years writing about this goddamn wizard game. Um,
Yeah, how do you know when you're going to be done? Uh,
you have to stop. You have to stop. I think for me, I know I'm done when I'm 80% of the way there and I don't want to do it anymore. And then I say, okay, I'm gonna pull the last 20% out of me and then call it done. Even if like there was so much more I could have written. I just have to say that's enough at a certain point. The thing about being a control freak and a perfectionist is that you'll never succeed at it. So you kind of have to like either accept that your main driving force is a constant sense of failure, or you have to like, I don't know, stop being a control freak and a perfectionist. And so I feel like so often like with my work, it's like there's all these little tweaks I'm constantly making, all these things I'm trying with the knowledge that eventually I'm gonna have to let go and move on, and that it will be ossified in the state that I leave it in, even if that's not the state that I want it to be in. But you can't the thing that is nice about games is you can always come back for another go, right? Like you can always do a second edition. You can always say like, okay, I'm just going in and writing more if you want to later on. But very often I realize when I there's it's been very rare that I have like set aside a game that I felt was incomplete and then come back to it and wanted to add more. Very often I will feel like there's so much more I could have done, released it out into the world and then come back to it a year later and been like, actually, that was good. I should have stopped there. It was the right time to stop. I do think often when working on a game, I do find myself hitting the limits of a game, which is where I will play a game and I'll play test a game and I'll have experiences that I find so interesting, but I realize the game can't do, right? That there's this kind of like there's like a thing where it's like with Yazebas where I'm playtesting and I start to realize there's this really interesting thing that can happen when you start getting into the nature of power and the nature like the limits of power and like the fact that Yazeba like has this house that she like is supposed to care for but is also its boss and also like has no money and like what is up with that and this kind of like weird twisting quality that like the game wasn't really well equipped to do. And so I started working on another game to kind of give me an angle into that, and that kind of became Seven Part Pact. And so it's like at each step, I try to kind of find the place where if I go any further, the game stops being what it is, and then I take that and I make that my new center point for the next thing I work on. And that's not like a process, that's just like a pattern.
Yeah, I mean, we're going to be building, as you know, to on essay projects, these kinds of experimental kinds of projects that are in a limited amount of time. It's almost like a game jam, right? In terms of there's a limited amount of time. It's not going to be perfect. If you had advice for that kind of process, what would you say?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the best thing you can do if you want to build a little game is you find a little physical, mechanical, tactile thing. And then you think about how that makes you think about the rest of the world, right? That if the way I like to do it is it's like, maybe you put some dice in a box and you rattle the box around and then you open up the box and you start digging through and you're like, this kind of makes me feel like a raccoon. Or you start building a little tower out of Jenga block. You're playing Jenga and you're like, oh, this makes me feel really stressed out. And then you're like, what does that let me talk about, right? Like if a Jenga tower makes me feel stressed out, how can I use that to reflect another kind of stress? How can I use that to talk about something else? Frequently, I think games and poetry have a lot in common, especially older forms of poetry that are more structural. Um, in that, like there's this metaphorical relationship between these two things, right? That you cannot successfully one for one create a relationship, right? Because the thing about a metaphor is all metaphors are bad metaphors, right? If I say, my lover is as beautiful as a summer's day, uh, that there will be a failure point of that metaphor. There will be ways in which that's not true because the only thing that my lover is actually like is my lover, right? And so, but if I say my lover is, and the only thing like a summer's day is the summer's day, but I can say my lover is like a summer's day, smells just as sweet, just as pleasant to be around. But then if someone comes in and is like full of ants, makes you sweaty, it's like, oh, now the metaphor falls apart, right? And so with games, similarly, there's a little bit of a quality of like, falling in love with you is a bit like a trick-taking card game, or like, maybe even to make it more basic, right? Running from that monster feels like playing Jenga. And like that is a metaphorical relationship. And that's kind of what you're doing is you're just setting up a little metaphorical relationship. It's just the difference being instead of being two concepts that are described, one of them is a tactile thing. So hopefully that's helpful to think about. If nothing else, find a little action and make it a metaphor for something else. And that's probably a game.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good place to start, especially for folks who are thinking that they might try their hand at games. And this is something that is totally legit as a thing to try out in this kind of space. And I'm curious, when you hit those walls, um, it talk to me about uh it's like playtesting is a little bit like peer review in some
Mhm.
ways. In other
Yes.
ways it's not. But talk to me about other people, which I realize is a weird question to ask you right now, but
Other people. Well, in what sense?
in the sense of like how you think about feedback, be
Yeah.
it a play report, be it something else.
I think always for me, I mean, again, the central focus being on this emotional world. And it's also just knowing kind of when to separate out people who are engaging in good faith and also the ways in which people engage with their biases, right? That kind of being a game designer is a lot of ways an act of trust, right? That like on both sides, because when you are a player, I think there's a way Bernie DeKoven puts it in the Well Played Game, where it's like, as players, you can make any game experience if you try hard enough, but that's a lot of work. And so you go to someone you can trust to get a play experience that's really what you're looking for, right? If you're like, I want to play a game that does these specific things for me, and then you go to someone you trust, maybe like, if you're a kid on the playground and you're like, I want to play a game that lets me run around a lot, and then you go to a teacher or an older sibling or something, and they're like, you should try playing tag, and you're like, okay, and then it gives you the thing you want and you got it because you trusted them. A game designer kind of is that same trust, right? It's like I want a game, like you get older and your tastes get more refined and you're like I want a game that lets me precisely experience what it's like to be a 18th century Molly in, in Georgian era England, and it's like great. Someone has made that and you can get it, they will give it to you and everyone can pull it off the shelf.
Oh, and I can
And like
pull it
that's
off
it.
the shelf. It's very heavy.
It's a great game. It's yeah. That and like so you can go and like you can get that very precise experience, but you're getting it because you trust the game designer. And so if you don't trust the game designer, you can't get it from them. You don't trust them. And similarly, if you do like if you come to the game and you're like, oh, but the only game I know how to play is tag, you're gonna interface with that game in really weird ways, and that trust is gonna be strained. And so whenever someone comes to me about like I don't know, like when I give people my game, there's an act of trust of like I'm trusting them to take it in good faith, and they're trusting me that I will have put the work in that's necessary for them to have the experience that I'm offering them. They might not like the experience I offer them, but they've got the trust in me that I'm providing them with that. Um, and so I think oftentimes when I see people engage, when I get feedback on my games, I try to kind of be like, well, what biases are they bringing in? Are they speaking in faith? Are they engaging with my game in good faith? Are they, then also like, are they trusting me? Do they trust that I'll give them what they're looking for? Or in their lack of trust, are they substituting and changing and then being dissatisfied, right? In the same way that like if you find a recipe online and you don't trust the person who posted the recipe, and then you follow their recipe, but you make a bunch of substitutions because you don't trust them, and then the recipe turns out bad. It's like, okay, well, sometimes on some level, that's not my fault, you know?
Yeah, no, I think it's really interesting, and this is why I love teaching games in a class like this, is because of that kind of it makes explicit that which is implicit when we read a work of fiction or a poem or listen to music. There's still that kind of we are bringing something into it, we are encountering it with either good faith or with a lot of
Hmm.
connotations attached to it. But this makes us have to kind of think about it even more intentionally in all kinds of ways.
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
which is wild and weird. And I'm curious if there are any, I realize we're on camera off mode today, and it's one of those days. But if there are
I
any other
feel it.
questions, um, folks can either unmute or can type something into chat. Um, I'm going to vamp for just a hot second to see if anybody does that. But I'll just note that we're flipping the readings a little bit because we're putting off, obviously, reading Meg stuff until Meg is here on the week of February 8th. We're gonna play Yazeba's, and we're taking a look at some scholarship, as Jay has noted. A lot of the stuff that's about close reading games comes to us from video games. So we've got Fullerton and Farber's The Well Read Game, which I will just say right now, I don't love uniformly. It's got some real problems in how it um kind of creates a canon, and I'll talk about those a little bit on Wednesday. But in terms of this kind of definition of efferent and aesthetic reading methods, literally that is what Jay has been talking about. That kind of efferent is thinking about this as a manual, thinking about this as a guide to do a thing. And aesthetic is how does it make you feel? So this conversation leads really beautifully into what Fullerton and Farber are guiding in their initial chapters of how to read a game. So that's really awesome. Jules, you got something for us? Or just kindly turning your face on so we can see your sweet face before we're done?
Hey, I mean, I can ask a question. Also, I had to turn my camera off because my contact kept messing up and I didn't think
No,
you wanted to see me play with my eye.
no,
Um,
you know how I feel about eyeball stuff. So yes, thank you.
yeah, you're welcome. Um, so you did mention that this game took like years to produce. And I'm kind of like interested in editing in some capacity.
Mhm.
So how different was the like initial version of this game to the one that got like produced
Oh,
and published?
well, so it's RPGs tend to be different because playtesting is a form of editing, right? Playtesting is kind of a beta reading process, and also because the way RPGs as an industry work is there's a lot more self-publishing than there are these kind of like in traditional publishing, there's these big publishing houses, and then the editor of that publishing house ideally is kind of a real, they're a real co-producer of the object. Whereas when you're a small publisher or self-publisher, you are your own editor in certain ways, right? There's obviously an editing team, but that editing team was brought in to tidy up a vision that I set, right? So there's like at a publishing house, you would see like, the author comes in with the manuscript, and then the managing editor is going to set kind of a goal for what that looks like. And then like, like that gets kind of rearranged to like there's kind of a lot of back and forth with different editors along the chain. With RPGs, it's much more like I set the, in the case of Yazeba's, myself and Maisie set the vision, the editors work towards that vision. Which just means that like the Ashcan, or the earlier forms of the game, the Ashcan being kind of an intentionally cut down version of the text, they're very similar to the final thing in terms of goals, right? There's a lot of like, we figured out what we wanted early, did a lot of it, and then did a lot of work to clarify towards that and like to clean towards that. So that's pretty common in RPGs, is that like you're not going to necessarily see that kind of like big editorial oversight, because a lot more of that is going to happen during the playtesting process, right? That like I might have an idea and then I playtest it and I realize it's a bad direction, I go a different way, and that the equivalent of that is something you would see like when writing the second or third draft of a novel. But in the RPG world, it's kind of it happens earlier and without kind of an editorial oversight. So just different traditions, different relationships to editing, but the a lot of the development of Yazeba's was literally just writing the fucking thing, and then a lot of like commissioning the art and doing the layout, and then like 6 months, or in the case of Yazeba's, a goddamn year to print the book. And so like you just get a lot of, it's production timelines. You kind of get into the broader process of manufacturing at a certain point.
Yeah, and I've put into the links the Ashcan, which is one of the ways that betas are referred to, or initial drafts for playtesting and circulation, as well as the development log for Die, which we'll be taking a look at later this semester. And if you look at just the development log with the dates, I mean, I'm actually reconstructing the timeline under which Die was offered for different open and closed. Open means anybody can download it. Closed is a
Mhm.
small group is selected for playtesting particular parts of the rule set. But you can see the kind of, even just in looking at this development log, some of the kind of, oh, this was the typo fix version. This is, we fixed the fool. Jay is working on 7-part pact kind of wizard by wizard at this point in terms
Mhm.
of revising the most recent version of 7-part pact in these kinds
Yeah.
of ways.
And like Seven Part Pact started in 2022 as a game that was set in 1700s Britain, and then did I not tell you that it was
No,
originally a
you
19th
did not
century
tell me
Mr.
this was an
Norrell
18th
game
century game.
explicitly?
Damn
Yeah,
it.
yeah, it was, well, it was originally a Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell game, like very explicitly. It was just like me riffing on that. And then I was like, I can't take it anymore. Like having to write about the historical situation obscures my ability to write about the things that I'm here to write about. That like history kind of, the context of it all consumes it. And so I pivoted to have it be about fantasy. But like if you go through my Patreon, you can see the different drafts and when they were released and when I've been working on them. So like there's a real chronology of like wizard by wizard writing these books, and then like, okay, I'm done with them all, back to the beginning, back to that, I learn the lessons by the end of them, and then I come back to the beginning and over again.
Yeah.
It's kind of the repetitive process.
Right, which is why I say that anything like, so for particular kinds of unessays, especially ones that are experiments with games, it is going to be the first attempt. It's not going to be the fullest expression. We hope we get you to a initial play test, not necessarily like it will not be the perfect and polished thing.
And
Jay,
also, especially because the initial playtest is the most important thing, right? My goal is always get the game in front of people as soon as possible. So, writing a game, I will write a game in the evening, and then by the next day, I'll be playtesting it. So,
yes, I love that. Jay, thank you so much. This has been
yeah,
so
thank
amazing.
you.
Thank you
Yeah.
guys. This recording, once I'm off, it'll, in a few hours, I'll be adding it to the week 4 instructions document so that you have reference to it, because I think it's going to be a useful resource for us to come back to. And you'll have access to both the recording and the transcript. But thank you, Jay. I'm going to stop the recording now. And